The women of the town tightly shut their shutters. They had been warned not to look out the windows. But some husbands peeked through the cracks, for such a sight comes but once in a lifetime. Through the streets of Coventry strode a white horse, carrying the lady of these lands, Lady Godiva. And apart from her flowing hair and a necklace, she wore nothing at all. It was a hot July day, but the rider had not shed her dress due to the heat. She had made a bet with her husband that she would take this step, and if she kept her promise, he would surely lower the taxes. In Old English, Godiva means gift of God. She was born in the early years of the 11th century, and legend speaks of her beauty, fiery red hair and fair skin. Godiva most likely hailed from the northern part of the British Isles. Little is known about her early years, but if the chronicles of Ely Abbey, written a century later, are to be believed, Godiva was married twice. First to a modest landowner, and then, after being widowed, she caught the eye of Leofric, the Earl of Mercia. This Earl Leofric was one of the allies of King Knut the Great, who ruled England. The king, a Dane by birth, highly valued the support of a representative of the Old English nobility. Leofric was granted far more privileges than other earls. For instance, he could administer justice in his lands without consulting the king. Unsurprisingly, the Lord of Mercia had no shortage of enemies. For decades, the earl rivaled other powerful lords on the island. When the paths of Lady Godiva and Leofric crossed remains a mystery. But in the 30s of the 11th century their names are already mentioned together, in connection with rich offerings to the monasteries, and Earl Leofric even founded a Benedictine monastery at Coventry. A decade later, Godiva and Leofric gifted land to the abbey in Worcester and made substantial offerings to churches in Chester and Evesham. There is even an account of Godiva donating a gold necklace worth 100 marks to another monastery. The lords of Mercia were spoken of as kind, God-fearing, and exceedingly generous people. But in the 13th century, a different story about Godiva emerged, that her husband, Earl Leofric, had fallen into financial need. His rivalry with the Earl of Wessex required him to raise an army, and so, for this purpose, the Lord of Mercia imposed such heavy taxes on his people that ordinary folk were pushed to the brink of ruin. Tenants and merchants turned to Lady Godiva for justice. They knew she was kind and would try to help. The legend goes that Lady Godiva pleaded with her husband to lower the taxes, but he refused. Matters of state demanded decisive action from him. Then the earl's wife proposed a deal. She would fulfill any condition Leofric set, no matter how outrageous, and in return, he would heed her request. And so, the infamous ride of the naked Godiva through the streets of Coventry took place. Artists and sculptors of the 19th century immortalized Lady Godiva's daring act in their works. However, the story of the unclothed rider is, in all likelihood, a beautiful myth. Roger of Wendover, who wrote it down in the mid-13th century, was likely inspired by an ancient pagan fertility ritual that had nothing to do with Godiva. Interestingly, in the 16th century, another chronicler, Richard Grafton, insisted on the same version, claiming he had read about it in certain old abbey scrolls. Of course, no such scrolls confirming his account have ever been found. But where there's smoke, there's fire. The legend of the fearless rider had to come from somewhere. There is, however, a reconciling version of the story. That Lady Godiva did indeed ask her husband to reduce the taxes, but she didn't ride through the streets of the city to do so. Instead, she sold her jewelry and began appearing without her attendants, walking alone, simply and even poorly dressed. A highly unusual sight for a noblewoman and the wife of an earl. Perhaps it was this act that astonished the people of Coventry. Over time, the story was embellished with additional details. Earl Leofric died, and Godiva lived to see the Norman conquest of England. She managed to retain her lands and her rights as the Lady of Mercia, but the exact date of her death remains unknown. According to records, by the late 11th century, the lands of Godiva and Leofric had passed to others, meaning the beautiful woman on the white horse had left this world earlier. During the reign of King Richard II of England, Mosaic depictions of Leofric and Godiva were installed in the Holy Trinity Church in Coventry. To this day, they remain the most famous figures from the area. And the legend, first told in the 13th century, continues to spark interest and questions. Could the writer truly have traveled the streets unclothed?